All right, thank you all for joining us today. I am really pleased to have this opportunity. I think this is the first time I've ever moderated something called Cyber Hygiene. So I think we're all in for some great information regarding how to keep clean and remove disease. There are all levels of hygiene in the world today, and we can see the health effects of hygiene on a regular basis, from highly evolved societies down to less evolved societies. So it's obviously a challenge, but it really does bring us down to the basics. I am reminded of the previous sessions, and I'd like to just reflect on the fact that everybody seems to be talking about the data, the importance of the data, the criticality of the data, especially in critical infrastructure. And I was thinking as I was sitting out there that we have data everywhere and every bit to steal. And that brings us to the topic at hand with one of the most famous breaches in U.S. history, I believe, and that is the Office of Personnel Management. On our panel this morning, I will start down at the end. Greg Wilshusen is the Director of Information Security Issues at the GAO. We have Dan Waddell, is the Managing Director of North America for ISC Squared. We have Dr. Ron Ross, who probably to a cybersecurity crowd needs no introduction, but a fellow at NIST. And Mr. Tom Boyden, who is a Managing Director at GRA Quantum. So I'd like to open this session called Cyber Hygiene with a definition. And I'm going to put one of these candidates on the spot because they were not on our prep call the other day.
Uh-oh.
But I know he's going to know the answer. Mr. Ross,
Yeah.
what would be your definition of cyber hygiene?
I missed the prep call? I guess I did. So can you guys all hear back there? Are we good? Make sure.
I don't know. Is he on?
Are you good? Can you hear in the back? Good. Well, to me, cyber hygiene, I look at it very simplistically. I try to make a human analogy. To me, hygiene for a human is you get up in the morning, you take a shower, brush your teeth, and you shave, and you go out the door for the day. And that takes care of a certain aspect of your health and welfare. But if I'm eating improperly and I weigh way too much and I don't ever go to the gym and I don't get enough sleep, I'm not going to be very healthy. So I look at cyber hygiene as kind of the necessary part of security, and that can be things that you control as customers. You can patch your systems, you can count your boxes, you can do inventories, you can configure your firewalls, you can buy whatever security products that you can to help protect your perimeter. But there is a certain category of activities which the adversary will use to exploit your systems that goes way beyond your control. And that's something we're going to talk about in our upcoming publication that deals with engineering, security aspects of getting what I call below the waterline, making sure the hardware, the software, the firmware, the quality of those components is good enough to withstand cyber attacks, or certainly if the attack is successful, to limit the damage the adversary can do. As I heard last hour, can the adversary come in and steal 10 records, 100 records, or in the case of OPM, can they get out the door with 21 million? There's a difference. You can limit the damage. So cyber hygiene is necessary, but certainly not sufficient. And we'll talk, I guess, more about that later.
And I'd like to just add a couple comments too to that. In terms of cyber hygiene, we look at it as being the policies, practices that are intended to help protect and defend against cyber attacks, as well as protecting your data and systems. And just as Ron mentioned, it's kind of based upon control what you can control, because there's always going to be actions and activities that you won't be able to control. And if you take the steps necessary to harden your systems, establish the policies and procedures that are necessary to respond to cyber attacks, because you probably should go ahead and recognize that even with good security, you still may be vulnerable to a cyber attack. So knowing and understanding how to detect those, respond to them will be also very critical to keeping cyber hygiene.
Well, Greg, I do want to follow up on that. So as the proud father of a 7-year-old boy who loves to play in the mud and a 10-year-old girl who stays clean all the time. I'm struck by the fact that I have a really difficult time instituting hygiene into this little crazy boy. We know what people should be doing, and there is ample instructions, guidance, policy behind it. So, without putting you on the spot for OPM, what happens in the business of government that leads to issues like this?
Well, I think one, it's just probably to some extent at federal agencies, there's a lack of priority given to cybersecurity, or at least a minimal priority initially. The main business for many of the organizations is to deliver services to their constituents, whatever agency and service that might be. And when it comes to between installing and developing and operating information systems that are necessary to perform that agency's mission, that's going to take priority. And one of the things that needs to occur is that those systems are being operated securely. And sometimes that doesn't happen to the extent that it should. What we find in our audits is that agencies typically do not fully implement a mandated by Federal Information Security Modernization Act, an agency-wide information security program, in part because information security is primarily a management function. And so it's incumbent upon management to ensure that the appropriate resources, practices, and accountability measures are in place to assure that that's being performed.
Dan, in your view, are there enough resources applied to the field of cybersecurity in government today?
No. I think most people that are in this room have probably seen or heard about our Global Information Security Workforce Study. It's a biannual study, and the shortage is currently projected as 1.5 million by the year 2020. So certainly IIC squared is, in terms of the people, process, technology equation, we really like to focus on the people. So systems need patching, but people need patching too. And I think, to Greg's point, we're not only are we missing the compliance piece, but we're just missing the basic cyber hygiene for staff. So it's not just educating the cyber workforce, it's educating the workforce in cyber. So I think we need to collectively do a better job to introduce some really innovative methods to get staff, not just in the cyber or the IT vertical, but all across the organization, whether it's HR, finance, operations, legal, to really embrace what these threats are and really turn that user into the greatest asset, not the greatest vulnerability.
Who is the weakest link in cybersecurity, Dan?
People are. That's typically, obviously, from a software or hardware perspective, there are tons of vulnerabilities, but the easiest path is social engineering, getting a user to click on a link, or calling up the secretary to say, hey, I need the password reset for the boss and to get the credentials. And that's, if you look at how OPM happened, there were stolen credentials that got misused, and the insider got in because everybody thought, well, this was a trusted insider, so he or she must be doing things right. But once you get that key, right, to that front door or back door, because there really is no such thing, they're in. So it's people, in my opinion.
There's lots of talk about the value of data, credit card records versus healthcare records. OPM data was unlike those that could traditionally be used for monetary gain. You have some unique background in dealing with sensitive information. Tell us a little bit about that OPM data and the significance of that breach.
Sure. It's interesting. I think when everyone first became aware of the OPM breach, the immediate knee-jerk reaction was, how could this have happened to critical U.S. government infrastructure? So there was a quick reaction to how do we go about protecting this other institutions from a similar breach. But then there's the whole other half of it, which is more, in my view, the much more critical piece, which you're asking, is what do you do about the 22 million victims or plus that were both former and now, or current and possibly now former government officials? And the biggest question of all is, why were they targeted? What did they want? And what information was contained in those 22.5 million records? And truly, what was the main motivator for a nation state to go after to get it? And I'm sure there are several of us here that have been notified that we were victims in this breach, given the heavy government presence here. But the question I ask is, how useful is credit monitoring for you as a U.S. government employee when you know that the reason they came after you was so they can glean very specific information about who you are, possible motivations, vulnerabilities you have, so they can specifically go after people who they believe may have access to critical information in the US. So for me, that's the scary part. I don't really care if my credit score has dropped a little bit if I have a nation-state intelligence organization that has me in their crosshairs.
I think there's another aspect of that. The OPM breach was just the tip of the iceberg, because this is it is the worst breach I think we've ever had, because the target was not just OPM. I mean, I was a victim of that one because I have a top secret clearance, and a lot of my colleagues were also victims. But they went after the Blue Cross Blue Shield Anthem database, and I was also in that data. That's the federal healthcare system. And the third one they went after, which thank goodness I wasn't part of, was Ashley Madison. But there's a reason. I know that was good news. That was good news, actually. That was the only good news. But the reason they went after those three, there was no secret about that. They wanted to get all the people in the federal government who have top secret clearances, maybe top secret SCI, who have troubling health care issues and are cheating on their spouses. And what does that do? A simple database query gives you a target list. And there may be 20,000, 30,000, whatever it is. And then the next thing you're going to see is someone, you're at Panera Bread having breakfast, and someone kind of sidles up to you and says, hey, I know something about you that's a little bit embarrassing. Can we work this out? That's the gift that we'll keep on giving for generations. It affects me. It affects everybody in my family. My daughter works for a company that travels to China. These things are absolutely, you can't put a value on that level of data, the sensitivity and the value to an adversary. You just can't put a price tag on it.
No, when I think of the confidentiality, integrity, availability triad, right? So in the integrity piece of it, what if the Chinese got this and was able to actually get in and modify or add records into the clearance database? They could be creating, fake personas and really just be able to go to town. So that's another scary point too.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say that truly we don't know how far that information has been disseminated either. We know that in the US government, we have very trusted relationships with the Five Eyes. And you have to ask yourself, well, are the Chinese possibly motivated to share that information with their version of the Five Eyes? So in other words, maybe I'm not just at risk for any interaction that may have to deal with China, but we know China is very close to the North Koreans. We know that China has strategic relationships with Russia. So there's this self-awareness sort of hammer that got hit over all our heads where, oh my gosh, as you were pointing out, not just myself, but other people in my family. And when you correlate that data with other records that we were just discussing, perhaps travel records, if they know that I have a health issue that I disclosed in the SF-86 form that my mortgage was underwater, and suddenly I'm on a plane to Thailand and they know that, I might get some interest.
Yeah.
And how can I, and on top of it, I was on Facebook or Twitter talking about how upset I was about the current presidential elections and the direction the country was heading. So suddenly there's motivations, there are all these data points where they view me as someone that, man, this guy could be a live one, so let's talk to him.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what was mentioned about integrity. And that is really key, particularly for OPM, but also for potential attacks at other departments and agencies, such as the Department of Defense, where we have weapon systems that are being developed and designed. Just the value of that information, both from a confidentiality perspective, but also if an attacker wanted to put our research and development activities behind schedule by changing information that's critical to the design of our weapon systems, would also have a tremendous effect on our ability to defend our nation.
Greg, you often go out and survey or look at different individual agencies and cybersecurity posture of individual systems, mission-critical systems. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how that translates into execution minus the resource question that we've got, if that's the top issue that's facing us today?
Yes, we do audits at individual federal agencies and look at and drill down into their information security controls to how they configure and design their information systems, as well as look at their policies and procedures for managing those operations. And we also look at issues across federal government, looking at emerging trends or instances such as right now we're looking, for example, at the CISO. We're getting ready to issue a report in a couple months on just the activities and authorities of chief information security officers at the federal agencies and some of the challenges that they have. And what we have found over time is that agencies consistently have not implemented key basic security controls over their systems. And part is because they may not have the appropriate staff or the resources available. In some cases, it may be that they'll be acquiring new tools, but don't provide the sufficient training to those with significant security responsibilities. It's one thing, for example, to develop or to buy and acquire a new intrusion detection capability and response capability, but if your staff who is responsible for operating that and monitoring the data isn't trained in the data-specific tool, the efficiency and effectiveness with which they may be able to use it is going to be diminished. And that's something that we often find as well, is making sure that those with significant security responsibilities have the appropriate training for that. So it gets down to, again, both looking at the resources as well as the policies and practices at those agencies.
Dr. Ross, some people claim that this is a simple problem, and that if you just implement a couple of super critical controls, you can get rid of many of the core issues that lead to these breaches. But in fact, in some of these scenarios, they become incredibly complex with advanced persistent threats.
Right.
As the father, grandfather, and great-grandfather of the NIST SP series on so many information security topics, it would seem, and with a PhD, it would seem that this is an incredibly complex topic.
It's, I guess the grandfather thing, I signed up for Medicare recently. That's a good experience, those of you who are not there yet. In some sense, it's a simple problem. Other times, it's a complex problem. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. The complexity, first of all, we're drowning in complexity of all the systems and components and software, and it's just amazing it all works, and much less try to protect it. So we're going to have to solve that. That's more of an engineering problem, and we know how to do good engineering. We have 40 years of trusted technology principles and concepts. But there's also some systemic problems that have nothing to do with engineering, and that was what Greg was getting to before. I think I would characterize it by governance, leadership, and accountability. One of the things that OPM taught us, and this is not just about OPM, it's about any organization with large databases and authorizing their systems for operation. When you authorize a system, you take responsibility and you're accountable for the risk. You're supposed to understand the risk and then accept the risk. But who you have as an authorization official makes a big difference. Just take the OPM, for example. Their job was to produce as many clearances as they possibly could and do it effectively. That was their lane. But just think if you had an authorization process where they brought in 2 other stakeholders. So the OPM official was not the only one making the authorization decision. Let's say they knew they had DoD and IC, intelligence community people in that database. Just picture what it would have been like if it was a joint authorization. You had a DoD person, one from OPM, and then someone from the intelligence community. All 3 had to agree about here's the vulnerabilities that we have left. We're not using 2-factor for the going into the database. We're not doing this. We're not doing that. All the basics you talked about.
Yeah.
They would all 3 have to say yes in order for that system to be authorized. And I guarantee you, if the folks that I know in the DoD and the IC were looking at that stuff, they would have never authorized that system for operation. And the other point I would make about the big databases, and we all have big data now. Big databases we collect more data because we can, and we can store more of it. But you have to ask yourself, for your large databases, is there any reason why any individual has to have access to every record in that database in real time? I would argue most of the records in most databases can be taken offline even if they're that critical. I don't care how old the system is. We have a compensating control that my friend Jerry in the back will recognize. You could take those records offline, put them in a server, lock them in a vault, and put a Marine with an M16 in front of it. That's a good compensating control. And those records aren't going anywhere. Now, does it mean you can't access them as quickly sometimes? Well, when you're doing those security clearances, you're only working on a very, very tiny portion of that database at any one time. That's an engineering and an architecture problem that we know how to solve. So that's why I say this problem is a governance issue. It's about leadership, and it's about accountability and good engineering. And I think we have to turn the corner at some point and start to take a hard look at what we're doing to see if we can do better.
Governance, leadership, and accountability. Sounds like something the government should be doing. Dan, are you seeing those priorities? I know you do some work on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, it's really, the past year or so, it's really been more of an education piece, because I think even if we go back before OPM, I think Sony was the true game changer to actually get the folks on Capitol Hill to recognize just how important this is, because not only was it a theft problem, people were obviously losing jobs over at Sony, but then it was also a national security component. So yeah, as we go and have discussions with other ICIT fellows up on Capitol Hill, we're starting to see that they're starting to get it. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think the critical piece that when we go up there and we talk to these folks that are writing these bills is to slow down, right? The legislation is not supposed to be a knee-jerk reaction to it. We have to be writing these laws and these bills in a very smart and coordinated fashion, and make sure that the subject matter experts are able to introduce some language in there to make sure that the bills make sense. And especially because technology moves so quickly, we can't be writing those bills to make it so difficult then to respond.
Got it. Folks, start thinking about your questions. We would like to turn it over to the audience and give you an opportunity to speak to our colleagues up here. Tom, what are you seeing right now from a Silicon Valley perspective in that relationship with government and cyber?
Yeah, it's complicated these days, I think, as we all know. But back to Dr. Ross's point about data access management controls, I think the government, despite its imperfections, has set some very good standards for compartmentalizing information, for being given specific sections of a project that only you work on, but not being given the keys to the entire kingdom. And I think there's a bit of a collision course between data security and privacy and the freedom of information that we want, that we need in order to enable ourselves to do our work in private sector. But then the opposite train comes from the other direction, which is, well, yeah, but you can't have everything, because if you are breached, then suddenly the perpetrators are gained access or given access to far more than they would ever expect from just one single person. So I think the biggest takeaway and one of the hardest culture shifts that's taking place now in private industry is that need to compartmentalize information within an organization. And yes, there are some companies, especially out in Silicon Valley, that are highly secretive, that really get this. But by and large, a lot of the conversations I have, be it with board of directors or anyone within the C-suite, is, this extra layer of encryption or data access management control or having to call down the IT room is something that really bothers me. It's an inconvenience for me to do my work. But when you look at the long-term benefit of being able to just have those extra layers of security, we could really make a serious, significant step in moving the needle in the positive direction towards preventing the theft of IP, which right now is at the hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think that shift is taking place right now, which is really interesting. People understand encryption is important. It doesn't matter if you're using AES 256 or any open source tools, you got to use encryption. If you can encrypt your data and they get to your data, well, if they can't make sense of it, then that's a step in the right direction. So I think that's taking place now. How long it's going to take for that aircraft carrier to make a full turn, it's going to be a while, but certainly I think we're as we pointed out earlier, the Sony breach is open eyes to a lot, along with open eyes to a lot of private sector entities as well.
So, questions from the audience? Ma'am, right here.
Hello, gentlemen. My question is around focusing on the people aspect of this, because in looking at OPM and just in government in general, a lot of the issues that I see that we're facing is more from the perspective of the people that have to make the decisions, that are the acquisition executives, that are the non-IT cyber. They don't really understand kind of what the complexities are, what the risks are. You were mentioning about the authorization. Oftentimes you would see that individual and they're not really clear on what is it that I'm accepting. I just know that I have to sign this to get this online. And so I'm interested in kind of understanding kind of what are we doing, I guess, post-OPM to get that information and knowledge to the people that have to make the decisions that are not IT cyber?
I think that's an excellent question. Indeed, we did a review a couple of years ago, actually, on supply chain and looking at how agencies were assessing the cybersecurity risk with their IT purchases. And in one of the areas where we found agencies wanting is just what you mentioned, is that the acquisition folks often were not informed to any great extent by IT specialists or information security specialists who could discuss some of the cybersecurity risks associated with the different products and systems that were being contemplated for acquisition. One of the agencies that did a relatively good job of that was the Department of Defense, in which it brought together as part of an acquisition team. It had members from different program areas, including from the CIO's shop and the Chief Information Security Officers areas where information security specialists were involved in the decision and in the contemplation of these acquisitions. We found that that was something that probably should be transported and used at other agencies as well, because often, as you point out, acquisition officers and contracting officers may not have the full information about the cybersecurity risk associated with particular types of IT acquisitions, or just assuring that those IT acquisitions, that the security requirements are being adequately defined into those acquisitions. So I think that was an excellent question, and something that probably transpires throughout the entire federal government.
Yeah, and I also think it's a culture problem too, because a lot of our members who are CISOs are begging for authority and for accountability, and unfortunately, a lot of times they're buried in the org chart 3 or 4 levels deep, sometimes in an IT vertical or somewhere else. So we're starting to see that shift. As I have a lot of conversations with our members, not only here in the Beltway, but across the United States, and we're starting to see a shift where now we're getting security practitioners and professionals that are actually reporting directly to the CEO, or they're on the board of directors. Because now these folks realize across public, private sector, and academia that these are challenges that if they're not solved quickly, it's going to impact the mission, it's going to impact business, it's going to impact just our fabric of life. So culture, it's from top down. If we can start having these conversations and getting that culture change from the top down and making sure that that security professional has that authority and the accountability, I think we'll start to see some shift.
Yes, ma'am.
So on the people and accountability, and back to the OPM, we know I think it's the CIO lost her job after the OPM breach. And by all accounts, she was doing the right things. She was working to change the culture at OPM. She put the tools in place that uncovered the breach, had made significant strides in changing the security culture at OPM. And so how do we balance the need for a political gain at the cost of losing someone with the cyber leadership and enabling reporting of incidents and breaches without fear of lost jobs? So I think that's an interesting question in this age of how do we protect our cyber workforce that needs to blow the whistle but maybe in a political position where a job's at stake.
Sensitive balance. Dr. Ross, you talked about accountability. So
Yeah,
where's that balance?
that's a tough question. Yeah. When we're going to have cyber breaches, they're going to continue to happen. Yeah. And you can't use that as a metric for firing people, or there'd be nobody working in this town, in a couple of weeks. But I think there's a notion of due diligence, and one of the things that I think we're going to try to do, this is the time for my shameless plug, I guess, for the publication that's coming out of May the 4th, mark your calendars. The number is 800-160, and it's an engineering process, but it's not just a technical set of processes. We've taken an international standard, and it goes across the entire organization, from human factors to supply chain, acquisition, architecture, and it's the entire spectrum. And so to get to Jackie's point, I don't think we've armed our professionals with the process they need that's holistic. And it's just kind of like if you want to win a war and you're in the military, you've got to have a strategy and you've got to have tactics. Mm-hmm. Tactics win battles, strategy wins wars. And we continue to see a whole bunch of really great tactical solutions. I call them point solutions. We got a lot of vendors here who are producing great technology from the Silicon Valley all the way to the East Coast. But there's no grand strategy, and that's what 800-160 is supposed to try to do. Take a holistic view. And the very first two processes are stakeholder needs and mission business analysis. And we were talking at the break about how we're overwhelmed with the number of security controls that we have to choose from. But we have to be able to tie those controls back to specific security requirements, which are tied back to mission and business protection needs. And that thread has to run all the way through the development, the operations, and sustainment, all kind of couched in the organizational processes from human resources to configuration and risk management. And we just have never had that holistic view. And so that's why I think we have to go back and kind of circle the wagons here and find out, why are we spending more money than ever before on cybersecurity, even though maybe it's not enough, but we're having less success than ever before. There's got to be a reason for this, and it can't just be more of the new technology or more threat intelligence. If we were losing airplanes and bridges were collapsing and planes were crashing, the first folks we bring in would be the engineers and the scientists. What's the root cause analysis here? What's going on? First thing we do when we have a cyber breach, we gather more threat intelligence. And that's got to end, you know? Or we're going to be sitting here 20 years from now having the same discussions, talking about the problem and never fixing anything. So there's help on the way, I think, and I can't wait for you guys to see the document. It's technical in some sense, but it's not technical in other sense.
Greg, you also testify on Capitol Hill in front of members of Congress who are looking, I think, very deeply at that accountability. Would you have a perspective on what they're looking for these days and how they'd like to enact it without destroying exactly the concept that the woman asked?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a increased awareness and attention and emphasis up on Capitol Hill to look at the cybersecurity situation across the federal government. Just over the last 2 weeks, I was at 3 hearings on IRS information security. And this, of course, we issued a report back in March on it, but it was also during the tax filing season where there's also greater awareness of information security issues at the IRS. And I think across the government and within Capitol Hill, many different agencies or many different committees and members are trying to grasp and get a handle over cybersecurity within the federal government. It's probably one of the issues that spans across more agency or more committees on the Hill than probably many of the other types of issues confronting federal government. And they're trying to learn, they're trying to gain information about how to improve federal information security, what Congress can do to better help agencies protect the information that they indeed are entrusted to protect. And that's something that I think we'll continue to do. There's been, as you know, over the last several years, new laws have come out to include FISMA Modernization Act, to include the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, and there's a number of other bills that are likely to be examined over the next, this year before going into the next Congress. But there is a great deal of interest, attention up on the Hill, and I think that will continue for a while.
And if I may, just to apply this discussion on accountability and risk management to private industry, we talk to a lot of general counsels, a lot of outside counsels, and that's one of the biggest questions they have is if there is a breach and the fiduciary responsibility question is put in play, and we are asked, did we do everything in our power from a strategy point, as Dr. Ross was talking about, did that particular company do everything it could have done that is reasonably expected of them to develop a strategy that could have prevented that from happening? And if not, then that's when you're starting to see the trends of the class action lawsuits and the litigious types of actions that are taken against companies that were viewed as being negligent. So the need to have a long-term strategy laid out at the beginning, so later when a company is breached and they're approached by shareholders or whoever that are wanting to see if they were taking cybersecurity seriously, they can point back to board meetings, they can look at events that they have recorded in their ledgers of, hey, yeah, we did take it seriously. We didn't just go out and buy a fancy appliance to plug in our network, but we addressed everything from a hygiene standpoint of, hey, we need to look at this, not just IDS, but IPS, and what is our incident response plan? And those companies that are doing that now are saving themselves millions of dollars in litigation fees and lawsuits because they are having that vision and that foresight.
I think my question kind of jumps into accountability and culture and people. But, you know, we have great standards. NIST produces wonderful standards, cream of the crop. And I think academically, IAC Squared has great expectations academically. But are we still in the gray area that, you know, I want you to get a CISSP, or do I want you to perform as a good CISSP? I want you to have a requirement, or I want you to perform it. And are we actually at a stage that we have regulatory requirements, or are we performing it? Because I want you to be a good CISSP, not pass the exam. I want you to configure a firewall, manage it and detect for precursors, have a proactive plan to correct that action and prevent those that we can prevent, have a recovery plan as soon as possible. I don't want you just to have a firewall. And I think that regulations may not work, but maybe performance does. Are we using performance standards, or are we using requirements? Because the government uses a lot of regulations and a lot of audits, and we fail in that area.
Whether you regulate or not, I mean, certainly FISMA is mandated across the government, but the private sector has most of the critical infrastructure. So I think you have to go back. Everything in our new publication, we have every process has a set of outcomes. So it's very outcome-based. And I think that gets to the first part of your question. Do you want to just have a certificate, or do you want to have the ability to really demonstrate you know how to do the job? Yep. I think they're both important. And I think, we talked a lot today about the fundamentals. It's no different than a football team. No matter how fancy those plays get, everything starts out from a high school team to the Baltimore Ravens or the Washington Redskins of blocking and tackling. Those are fundamentals. And so, you have to have the skills, though. I think one of the things that makes this problem more difficult is there's a whole range of skills defined in our cyber workforce framework now, everywhere from configuring firewalls, but we also, this is a big part of this problem is industry-based. You don't control the source code in the operating system from Microsoft. So you rely on them to have qualified security engineers building that code, making that code as good as it can be. Your job then maybe being an acquisition person, you're buying different components. And one of the things we're going to highlight in the 800 or 160 is giving you the ability to choose between one operating system or another one. Why should you buy Microsoft Windows versus SE Linux? Well, they're different operating systems. They have different capabilities, but shouldn't you have the ability to choose, like the gentleman said earlier, they don't use Java code because it's riskier from their perspective. You have to understand that's transparency. And so, yes, it's important to have the skills to do the firewalls and be able to actually execute, play the block and tackle to win the football game. But you also have to have the ability to understand how systems are built, firmware, hardware, software, and how it all comes together.
Yeah, and to touch on your CISSP point, certification is just the beginning. And my boss, Dave Scherer, the CEO of ICIT Squared, will tell you, having 100 CISSPs in what agency is unrealistic, right? Because that bar is probably a little bit high. What we could be doing a better job with, and I know this is something Davina, who's going to be on the next panel, talking about how we get K through 12, how we get STEM, how we start to build bridges for the academia. So we're building that next generation of the cybersecurity workforce. But, those students, those kids, they're not going to be CISSPs right off the bat. So what's that bridge that kind of gets us to whatever certification that you have? And then once you get it, how are you maintaining it through continuing education, through webinars, through cyber ranges to actually practice some hands-on skills? So I think that that's an important point. We need to start thinking about what the next generation is going to be, and then how do we get those students really engaged and building programs to get them in the pipeline.
Right.
Okay, I think we're going to start to wrap up here. In closing, we've heard lots of doom and gloom. We've heard lots of challenges. We hear resource challenges, cyber challenges, the complexity of it, getting back to basics, building security in a proper systems engineering context. So lots of information that we've shared and experienced today. But the problem keeps getting worse, as Dr. Ross pointed out. So in order to help the audience understand the positives and the forward movement, I'd just like to go down the line, starting with Greg, and offer one piece of wisdom that if somebody could take back to the office today and act on it, they would be helping themselves or their organization out in cybersecurity.
Well, I guess the first thing would be know thyself, and that is know your environment, know what systems you have, your good inventories, know what needs to secure them, and also know your contractors. Often agencies sometimes take the view of fire and forget when they hire certain services out to contractors. They're still responsible for assuring that contractor is implementing effective security. So understand and hold your contractors accountable as well.
Okay, Greg, I asked for one and you gave me two. So
was
know
kind of a
thyself and know
blended
thy
one,
contractors.
right?
They're both valid. Dan.
If I had to pick one today, it would be mentor. There are a lot of very smart people in this room that are not just cybersecurity professionals, but just business professionals that get why cybersecurity is really important. I would ask that you go back to your agency, your company, and look for a mentoring program and try to engage with that next generation to make sure that you're passing on the knowledge and help build the next generation of the cybersecurity workforce.
I like that, Dan. Nice.
That's a tough question. I think it would challenge the culture and the institutional bureaucracy, because those things are going to bring you down faster than any adversary will, whether it's the acquisition process or just the breadth and the depth of what you have to deal with. And you have to challenge the conventional wisdom, the culture, and say, we know how to do this problem. Take a deep breath. Don't try to solve every problem. Focus on the things that you can handle today. And sometimes those are simple things, and sometimes they'll be more complicated and take a few more days or months to handle. But challenge the culture. That's the first thing I would try to do.
That's a really interesting point. I just, as a sidebar, I read an article this weekend that said that there's a number of very high-profile, innovative Silicon Valley companies that are now selling their wares outside of the U.S. before they sell inside the U.S. They're trying to sell to the Pentagon, and they just can't do it. The sales cycles are too long, bureaucratic challenges in the acquisition process, so sad state of affairs. Tom, from Silicon Valley.
Sure.
Good stuff.
Right. No, I mean, I would say, yeah, absolutely. But most important that we've seen so many of the breaches, so many of the problems that have resulted from these breaches have been the result of poor communication between the IT team, the technical folks, and the non-technical folks who are the decision makers in most cases in the C-suite or in the top echelon of an organization. And we're past the political or how it's no longer a stigma, so to speak, to have been a victim of a breach. It's okay to talk about it as a company or as an organization and say, these are our expertise gaps. This is where we really need a lot of help. The IT teams need to speak up and go to their managers and say, listen, we really need someone who's an expert in artificial intelligence or in machine-based learning, someone who we can help fill this gap, and have that discussion so that at the end of the day, the C-suite or the executives aren't just writing checks and not knowing what that's actually going towards, but they're a part of it and viewing cybersecurity not as an IT problem, but as a business problem.
Boom. Go Caps, go Nats. They've had some good days lately. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank our panelists here.